Hi everyone, it's Mr. Sinti, and today I have the pleasure of talking to you about epithelial tissue. And epithelial tissue is a really important tissue that makes up the human body. And interestingly enough, it's one of four different tissue types: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous tissue. Those four tissue types comprise the whole human body. And if you're studying anatomy and physiology, you'll encounter these tissues no matter what system you're studying because it's found throughout the body. Each of these tissues were composed of these tissues. There's a whole branch of physiology that is involved with the study of tissues. It's that important. It's called histology. And so, what's interesting, what I want to say about it before getting into epithelial tissue, which is what this video is all about, it's that on the most fundamental level, you're going to need to know that these tissues are where it all happens. It's the epithelial tissue, the connective tissue, the muscle, and the nerve are really the fabric of the entire body. And so it's important to dive into it. It's important. There's not a lot of detail. I mean, there is a lot of detail, but the detail isn't trivial. In other words, the time that you invest in understanding, like even what seems to be the most obscure fact, will really be an investment because I assure you it'll be coming up in the future. Um, Again, if you specialize, if you're going into medicine, if you're studying pathology, you can become a specialist and looking at slides of tissues and seeing what has gone wrong with that tissue, see what sort of diseases that are happening. And so let me just jump right into this conversation. It's very exciting. I can't wait to do it. And so the very first tissue that I want to introduce to you is epithelial tissue. And basically, one of the characteristics, as you can see from this sort of cartoon drawing here, one of the characteristics of it is that it covers the outside of the body, in other words, the skin, but it also is on the outside of all the organs, which are on the inside, and it lines the entire body cavity. And I know that may seem abstract to you, but I will go into more detail. As you can see here, this is what looks to be a drawing of a micrograph under the microscope. This upper layer right here, and let me sort of animate this upper layer is what I mean by epithelial tissue. As it turns out, you're able to see two different kinds of tissues here. This is epithelial tissue, and then everything below that is what appears to be connective tissue, right over here, loose connective tissue. And we'll get into that in a different video. How do I know that this is epithelial tissue? One of the things that I'm looking for in epithelial tissue is that it's the tissue that is directly associated with the free space. I'm going to write that there, free space. So in other words, this could be inside of an organ or on the outside of the body, but there's free space. And so there's this interaction that epithelial has with the free space because it's in direct contact. You'll never find epithelial tissue below. So connective tissue is something that's below epithelial often. Now, another characteristic of epithelial tissue is that the cells are very closely associated with each other. They're very closely connected. It's sort of like a fence. And like a real fence, a fence serves as protection. And so that's one of the functions of epithelial tissue. We'll get into that in this video. But cells close to each other. Now, I'm going under the assumption that you don't have much of a background in this. And so when I say the cells are close to each other, you might ask this question in your mind sort of rhetorically. What else is there? I thought cells are all right next to each other. In fact, they don't have to be. Like, for example, in connective tissue, you can see these dark purples here. This is the nucleus of cells, and there's a little bit more spacing between cells and other tissues, whereas here, they're very closely connected to one another. You can see here's the nucleus. Now, the nucleus doesn't always have to be close to the bottom of the cell, but in this type of tissue, it is. You can start to look at, okay, here's epithelial tissue, and then you can subdivide it into different kinds of epithelial tissue, and we will do that. This happens to be something called simple, not because it's easy, but because it's a single cell layer. Single cell layer as opposed to many cell layers. So simple means single cell, and columnar is in reference to the shape of the cell. So they're column-like, like rectangles or columns. So simple columnar is the name of this epithelial tissue. Okay. So one of the main functions, I alluded to this, I like to foreshadow probably more than I should. One of the main functions of epithelial tissue is that it serves as a protection because, again, like the skin, you might already know this, but the skin serves to protect us from microorganisms trying to invade our body, get us sick. And so it is the first line of defense for the body. So it's a form of protection. And so not just the skin, but inside of the ear, inside of your urethra, inside of the rectum. So any place where microorganisms are trying to invade us, epithelial tissue is going to protect. Now, I mentioned before that this slide over here, this was called simple because it's a single cell layer. This would be an example of something called stratified epithelial. Stratified because strata means layers, and so you have many layers comprising what is epithelial tissue. So this really serves as a protection. So in other words, germs, let me go germs, another color. Germs would have a difficult time penetrating this in order to get into the body. Now, secretion and absorption are two other critical functions of epithelial tissue. Not only does epithelial protect, but it's likely to secrete something to the free space, and it's likely to absorb something from the free space. Now, this might be an abstraction to you at first, but again, more examples will provide illumination for that. So protection, secretion, and absorption are the characteristic functions of epithelial tissue. So as you can see in this picture, this is a real micrograph under the light microscope. And you can see, let me highlight the cells. Let me go like even highlighter right here. So these are the epithelial cells, and these are simple because there's one cell layer, and they happen to be simple columnar. So they're over on this side, and they're over on this side. You're like, well, this is kind of weird. It's hard to get used to this, but this is actually a three-dimensional structure, and if I were to draw it all the way around, it would look like this. It's sort of like a little pokey, sort of like carpet. It has these little things that are sticking out. It's actually a close-up of something called a villi. As it turns out, this is found very often in the intestines. Now, in your intestines, I know we haven't studied the digestive system, but it's coming. Food gets broken down in the digestive system, and as it turns out, when it gets smaller and smaller and smaller, it'll be the epithelial tissue that absorbs it through the process of diffusion. Now, it isn't random that food gets broken down. Water will break it down, but it's kind of slow, and so these cells should secrete digestive enzymes that speed up the breakdown. And so can you see how this tissue both secretes and absorbs? So this is simple columnar, and it secretes digestive enzymes, sometimes called hydrolytic enzymes, and then it absorbs the small monomers of the food. And so do you notice how close the cells are to one another? And that's a characteristic of epithelial tissue. So this is epithelial tissue, and this is something other than epithelial tissue over here. And it's like, well, I mean, you say that. How do you know that? Well, again, it takes time. But the epithelial tissue is in contact with the free space. That's what this is. This is not free space. This is below the epithelial tissue. This is the free space. And so one of the ways in which the cells are so closely together is that they're like literally riveted together. There's proteins that connect between, this is a close-up of one cell. Pretty cool. So this represents, like, let's just say this cell. I'll highlight it like this. Here, that membrane is this. And then you can't see it, but it's very small, even if I go close. But do you see the cell membrane is actually convoluted? This is called brush border, meaning like in a brush, it's sort of pronged like that, which means that there's more surface area. And if there's more surface area, that means that this cell can secrete even more and absorb even more. So that's kind of cool. Sometimes it's called microvilli, or brush border. But what I was getting at earlier was the fact that the cells are close together and they're actually riveted together by a type of protein called a tight junction. These proteins that span between cell membranes of two adjacent cells, and they're literally connecting them together to prevent liquid from traveling in between the cells. Here's the nucleus. Here's the nucleus right there. Okay? So epithelial tissue can form a barrier, and again, like the skin, it's a form of protection. And so the fact that the cells are numerous like this and stratified means that it's kind of difficult for a germ to penetrate it. So epithelial tissue forms a barrier that protects us. And even if we get a cut, if we're bleeding, that means that the epithelial tissue has been penetrated, because as it turns out, let me change colors here, epithelial tissue, which is this, doesn't contain any blood vessels. And so the blood vessels would be down here. And so in order to actually have a cut, your epithelial tissue must be breached, and then the blood would be leaking out on top of the skin. I don't know if you've ever had this opportunity of getting a sliver. It's not a pleasant thing, but if you get a sliver in the skin, you might wonder about how is it possible to stick a needle into the skin and actually sort of like pry it loose. You can stick a needle in there and you can actually put the needle through your skin, and you're like, look, I have a needle in my skin and I'm not bleeding and it doesn't hurt. Well, as it turns out, these cell layers on the outside, stratified of epithelial, are dead. And so not only are they stratified, but they're dead, they don't hurt, there's no nerves in here as well. And so that is what it enables you to do that. Also, it serves not only a protection from bacteria, but it prevents water from being excreted from your body. Although we do have specialized sweat pores that can release water to the outside to help us cool off. But it also prevents water from getting out, but it prevents water from getting in. It would be quite detrimental to the body if you went swimming and the water was able to diffuse into your body. Obviously, you would swell and die as a consequence of that. So epithelial tissue is a great barrier. Now, just some detail about this. Like, let's see if you look at this picture, if you can tell what the epithelial cells are. The epithelial cells are these guys right here. And how do I know that? Because they're in contact with the free space. This blue is some kind of tissue that we haven't studied yet. This is epithelial right here. Actually, this is connective. But this is epithelial tissue, and it seems to be forming a circle. And that's because it's hard to get bearings when you look at these slides for the first time. And as a student, you can't become overwhelmed by it. You're just like, wow, I've never seen this before. So, just be in awe more than you are intimidated. That's a good philosophy in life. This represents a tube. So if you had a tube coming right at you and you sliced it, this is what it would look like. So this is a tube, and all the cells that line the inside of the tube are epithelial. These happen to be simple because there's one cell layer, and they're not column-like. I'd say they're more square or cube. So this is simple cuboidal. And you can see the red nucleus here. What do? They secrete, they absorb. And then do you notice this dark line on the bottom here? This is what I'm getting at. This line of protein that helps to anchor the epithelial tissue to the tissue below is called the basement membrane. Easy to remember because it's at the bottom of the cell. Basement. This is the basement membrane right in there. Okay? So here's more epithelial. So I'm trying to use diverse photographs so I can get you more comfortable with this. You're like, I don't see any epithelial. This is the epithelial right here. And how do I know that? Because it's in contact with the free space. And then below is the basement membrane. That's what this is, which is in contact with the connective tissue below. These red circles are not the cells, but they're the nucleus of the cell. Here's the cell. This is the nucleus of the cell. And you're like, this is something weird here, right? Well, this is a special cell that I'll be getting into in a moment, but it's a cell, if I were to draw it like this, kind of looks like a wine goblet or a water goblet. This cell is actually called a goblet cell, and it's infamous for secreting a lot of mucus. And so this mucus, which is mainly water, helps flow through the free space. Like, for example, if this is the digestive system or if it's inside the mouth, the mucus is coming out into the mouth and it's helping to move the food along, and it's helping to digest the food. So goblet cells secrete mucus. And then these cells can secrete digestive enzymes, but they don't always have to be enzymes, but they secrete and then they also absorb. So this is an example of, again, simple columnar. And underneath the cells is the basement membrane. Now, I don't mean to think that you are a chimpanzee, but I found this photograph to be kind of useful because it lays out all of the different kinds or types of epithelial tissue. Not to become overwhelmed, because you can sort of break up epithelial into whether there is a single cell layer, like this, or like this, or like this, or like this. And every time there's a single cell layer, it's called simple. And if there's many cell layers, like this, it's called stratified. You're like, well, there's more than just simple or stratified. You can also throw in a criteria about how the cell shape looks like. And so I mentioned this before. Do you see how this is called, looks like a column? So it's simple columnar. These cells are flat. They're kind of like floor tile. If you ever put in tiling in your house or in your bathroom, or someday you might in the future, you first lay down like the concrete, and then you might buy these little squares that then they're flat, like pancakes, and you just place them and you glue them to the bottom. There's some cells in the body that are flat like pancakes. And a pancake is a really, if you don't mind me going into this, a pancake, okay, picture this 3D, is really thin and it's really flat. And so what's fascinating about this, maybe if there's time in class we can demo this, a flat cell is really impressive in terms of surface area, and so therefore its specialty is secreting and absorbing. Its specialty is that. So flat cells like pancakes maximize the rate of diffusion, and that's rather critical. Now, this tissue doesn't maximize diffusion. If anything, stratified squamous, squamous is the word meaning flat, stratified squamous does not secrete as much or absorb as much as it does protect. So when there's many layers, it's more protective. This is more diffusion. This is more diffusion. This is more protection. This is more diffusion. Now, check out this one. This is not to play favorites, but this is one of my favorites right here. Do you see this one that's called Pseudostratified? It's a mouthful. Pseudostratified ciliated columnar. And you're like, oh, well, pseudo means like false, like not quite. And so when you quick glance at this tissue, you're like, stratified. Because why? See how the nucleus is like in each of the cells like random all over the place? So when you see that, you're like, well, maybe there's more than one cell. But there isn't. There's only one. Notice over here in the columnar, all the nuclei are close to the basement membrane. So it's pseudostratified. In other words, like, gee, I thought it was stratified, but it's actually simple. So it's actually called pseudostratified, but which means that it's simple. And then it's ciliated, because you see on the top of the cells, there's these little protein hairs. I'll exaggerate them. These little hairs, if I were to draw one cell, cells have these little protein extensions that can come out called cilia, and they're famous for moving or swaying back and forth. Sometimes single-celled organisms called protozoa literally move with the cilia. And you're like, why would our cells have cilia? It has something to do with movement, but the cells aren't really moving. Come back to that. So these cells have cilia as well. So here's a close-up of this so you can see it a little bit better. So there's two criteria: cell single layer and multiple layers, so that's simple or stratified, and then what the shape of the cell is. If it's flat, it's squamous. If it's a cube, it's cuboidal. If it's column-like, it's columnar. Okay, so we have cuboidal, columnar, and squamous if it's flat. And so here's another picture of simple squamous. Now, you're like, whoa, this doesn't look flat. Well, this is looking down. Like if you're standing looking down on pancakes, this is what it would look like. Or if you're looking at tile, this is what it would look like. But these are all very thin. If you were to be able to grab one of the cells and pull it out, it'd be really thin. In other words, you can just grab this guy right here and put it on its side, it would be flat, like a pancake. So this is looking down. So this tissue is specialized for diffusion and osmosis. And this is another picture of simple squamous, flat and thin. And so where would you find simple squamous in the body? you would find it, and again, we'll go over this in more detail when we study the respiratory system, but in the respiratory system, you have a windpipe that comes down from your mouth called the trachea. This is the larynx, which houses your vocal cords, but when you breathe in air, it comes down this one tube, sort of like an upside down tree. It comes down the trunk, and then it branches out in this left and right bronchi, and then eventually into smaller branches called bronchioles. And then it culminates and terminates into little air sacs. There's much more surface area in a circle, sort of like grapes, than it would if they came to points. And so in the alveoli, which is the name of the air sac, in the alveolar air sac, this is one alveoli. Now it's sliced, so, and obviously this is, see how this is three-dimensional, you can't see inside? So this is sliced, and you can see, let me draw it in. You're like, I don't see anything. These are the simple squamous cells that actually make up the air sac. And you're like, wow, that's pretty incredible. Yeah, they're very thin. And you're like, well, I'm not sure if I'm getting this. Well, if oxygen is inside the air sac, if we're breathing in oxygen from the outside, it's going to fill up the air sac. And then right next to the air sac, if I were to draw this, there's blood vessels that surround it like this. And so that is where gas exchange takes place. The carbon dioxide travels from the air sac into a capillary, which is not maybe the best picture of that, but a capillary is the smallest blood vessel that's also comprised of simple squamous, and so that goes right into the blood, and then carbon dioxide goes out into the air sac. So simple squamous is great for diffusion, and so it's best suited for diffusion. Simple squamous is because it's very thin and it has a lot of surface area, and so it lines the air sacs of our lung and also the smallest of our blood vessels called capillaries. There's going to be more to come on all of this, but I'm just introducing epithelial tissue. And so this is simple columnar, again, single cell layer and cube shape. And so you're like, okay, I guess I can identify it. Can you give me something else? And I'm like, well, it's close to the free space. Okay. Cells are next to each other. Okay. And if the nucleus is centrally located, it's kind of a characteristic of cuboidal. So there it is, simple cuboidal. I see it. Okay. And then, here's another drawing of it. There's the basement membrane. Here, the simple cuboidal. Why simple? One cell layer. Over here is the real picture. You're like, well, I like this picture. This is stained here under the microscope. So I see anything purple is epithelial and anything blue is connective. Yes, for this slide, but if you use different dyes, maybe not. But dyes are helpful. So there's the epithelial tissue. See, now we only used one dye. And so you can see here is the epithelial tissue right there. How do you know that? It's in contact with the free space. And then anything below that is something else, like connective tissue. So function of simple cuboidal, secretion, absorption. And it's mainly found in glands. Simple cuboidal is, and you're like, glands? I've heard of glands. I think I have glands. Yes, you have many glands, as it turns out. I don't want to start naming all the glands, but I could. But we have salivary glands, we have mammary glands, your pancreas is a gland, you have sebaceous glands, thyroid is a gland, thymus is a gland. You have all these glands in the body, and like, what is a gland? A gland is a group of cells. It's more to it than this, but just simply, it's a group of cells that's specialized in secretion. And so glands are usually composed of epithelial tissue. And so here's another picture of simple cuboidal if it's not totally clear. There it is, and this is 400 magnification under the light microscope. And so what does it do? It secretes and it absorbs. Simple cuboidal. Here's another picture of epithelial tissue, and this is simple columnar. Why is it called simple columnar? Because it's one cell layer right there. Notice the nuclei are close to the basement membrane, and the cells are kind of column-like. And so what do? They secrete and they absorb. Secrete and absorb. Simple epithelial tissue isn't necessarily the best at protection because it's thin, but it's good for diffusion. Another picture. So all right, where is the epithelial? There it is, right here, and there it is right there. So this is the epithelial tissue. Epithelial. You're like, well, hey, everything you say, everything you're showing is epithelial. This is not. This tissue right here is not. How do you know that? Do you notice here that the nuclei of the cells are far apart? So if I were to draw on a membrane, which I cannot see, I'm just making this up. If the membrane, do you see how the cells are kind of spaced out? And these are close together? So epithelial cells are close together, they're adjacent. And these are those goblet cells that I was telling you about before that secrete mucus. They don't actually have a stem and a little stand like this, but these are the ones that are secreting mucus like this into the free space. Why? For digestion. Okay, so goblet cells. If I were to highlight the goblet cell, it would be, it would be this one. Whoops, lost my pen. This is the goblet cell, goblet cell, goblet cell, goblet cell. These are the goblet cells. I don't know if you're familiar with the books Harry Potter. You probably are, but I think it's the goblet of fire is a prominent thing. A goblet, again, is like this container, and in Harry Potter it's fire, but in this case it's mucus. So here's a picture of a goblet cell and a goblet cell and a goblet cell, and it's like, wow, and this tissue seems to have a lot of goblet cells. We're going to be finding that, like, for example, in the intestine, we have a small intestine and a large intestine. As it turns out, the large intestine, sometimes called the colon, is where it's the final part of our digestive tract. And one of the things there is that any food material at that point hasn't been absorbed, and it sort of needs to be excreted in the form of feces. And so one of the things about the colon is that it has just a tremendous amount of goblet cells that secretes mucus, so that I know this is not a pleasant thought, but it lubricates the feces so that it can actually be excreted to the outside. So there's a lot of goblet cells. So you can kind of tell even where you are in the body just by looking at the tissue. And so here are some pictures of goblet cells right there. Here's the picture of the columnar cells. And again, this is one of those intestinal villi. Now, you might think, is this in the small intestine or in the large intestine? We're going to learn that this is classic small intestine, because the small intestine has many villi, which increase the surface area of the small intestine. So do you notice here, this is secretion of digestive enzymes and then absorption of food. That's what this tissue does best. Here's the goblet cells, and then this is connective tissue. This little sort of thing that looks like a tube right in here is called a lacteal. It's part of the lymphatic system. We will address it later. This is a real micrograph. Here the mucus is staining dark, so you can see the goblet cells are standing out a little bit. And so this secretes a lot of fluid and absorbs a lot of fluid. And so I like this slide. It's kind of like a little review. So see if you can test yourself. I tried to choose something that the answers weren't very clear. I can even pull this on you like this. Oh, don't look at that. Oh my God, what do we have here? So it's one cell layer. So it's simple, and it looks like simple cuboidal. This one looks like simple columnar. One can maybe argue that that's squamous, but I would say cuboidal. This one right here looks like what? It looks stratified, but it's not. So this is pseudostratified, and this is actually indeed stratified. So if you got all those correct, you're dominating. So here's that pseudostratified. I was just showing you this picture a second ago. Here's what it really looks like, not just a drawing. Do you see how the nuclei are all over the place? It's hard to see it, but it's only one cell layer, and it often has cilia. This is a real close-up, so you can see the cilia. So this is pseudostratified ciliated columnar, and it often looks like there's many rows, but not really. So it's not really truly layered, so it's pseudo. And so you can see it here. Here's the cilia, here's the goblet cell. And so this tissue is infamous for having a lot of goblet cells. So it's making a lot of mucus. Let me make it highlighter yellow. So it's making a lot of mucus. You're like, what's the point? Then the cilia are taking the mucus and they're sort of pushing the water, pushing the water, pushing the water. So as it turns out, I mentioned the trachea before, or your windpipe. As it turns out, when you breathe in a lot of dust. And God forbid, you're standing next to someone who is smoking. That would be a tragedy. But if you're breathing in dust and smoke, the lungs do not want that. And so they attempt to get, I'm going to make the dust as little black particles. So all the smoke and dust accumulates in the mucus, and then the cilia attempt to sway and move the mucus out of your trachea, and then you swallow it in your esophagus, which is going to lead to your stomach. And the stomach is kind of the termination of bacteria. There's a lot of acid in the stomach, and so one of the main functions of the stomach is to protect us from germs. So pseudostratified ciliated columnar plays protective roles. And here's a really close-up of that. Here's the pseudostratified, here's the cilia, here's the goblet cells, and there they are protecting us. Love this picture. This is scanning electron micrograph of a pseudostratified ciliated columnar. Here's a close-up of the cilia that are swaying to protect the tissue. And so the moving cilia help to move the mucus out of the respiratory system. Females also have cilia in their fallopian tubes to help move the egg that is released from the ovary down the fallopian tube to a place where it would be fertilized. Here's a beautiful picture of, right here, let me emphasize it. This is the epithelial tissue, whoops, right there. And here's a close-up of that, of the epithelial tissue. Now this is stratified, meaning that there's many, many, many layers. So this is stratified squamous epithelium. And this role is that of protection. Do you see how the many layers are hard to penetrate? And this is a close-up of the skin. So not only are the cells stratified, but they're dead, as I mentioned before. And one of the reasons that they die is that they're far from the blood. And they also fill up with a protein called keratin in a process called keratinization, which prevents water from penetrating. It's a very thick protein. We'll get more into that later. So this is a picture of stratified squamous for protection. It's in the skin. It lines some of the openings to the body, stratified squamous. Here's a picture of stratified cuboidal. In other words, more than one layer, but the cells are more cube-like than squamous. This makes up a variety of glands in the body. And again, this is a picture of that. Then we have stratified columnar. So again, many layers, but columnar in appearance. They make up protective roles. These are places where they're found, right here. And then finally, we have something called transitional epithelial, and it's found mostly in the bladder. It's called transitional because it can be seemingly single layer, or it could be stratified, and it really depends on the contents of the bladder. If you really have a full bladder, it's going to be all stretched out and it'll appear simple, but if you've just urinated, then it'll appear stratified. And so here's a picture of that, and this is sort of like an empty bladder, and this would be like a full bladder. See, it's kind of thin. And so here's a picture of transitional epithelial. And then finally, I will say that we have something called glandular epithelium, which is cells that are really specialized in secreting, like the pancreas is good for that. It secretes digestive enzymes. And the glands could be either exocrine, which means that they secrete to the outside, like for example sweat glands or sebaceous glands or oil, or into ducts. But if you're a gland that secretes into the blood, you're considered to be an endocrine gland. Much more to come on both of those. And then if you have glandular epithelial, like for example, this is a gland, the thyroid, you could secrete mucus or you could secrete hormones, and they're stored into these little vessels right in here. And so finally, we have merocrine glands, apocrine glands, and holocrine glands. And these are whether or not you're just secreting directly, or if parts of the cells are being branched off, or the whole cell is branching off. And examples of this is sebaceous gland, mammary gland, and pancreas. So I hope you enjoyed this slideshow on the epithelial tissue of the human body. Thanks for watching.